Indiana beats Penn State in the game of the year. UNC makes a statement against NC State. And is Michigan finally for real? I'm Jay Smith, and this is After Further Review.
And now, after further review, a Clemson student's perspective on sports.
There's a personal foul on number 99 of the defense. After he tackled the quarterback, he's giving them business down there. That's a 15-yard penalty.
Welcome in, everyone. I'm Jay Smith, and this is After Further Review. Thanks so much for tuning in. Again, whether it's through the podcast or if you are watching on Facebook. And man, oh man, did we have a wild week of college football from week 8. Big Ten was back. Obviously, that was the big storyline coming into this weekend, right? It was an opportunity to see what the Big Ten was going to bring to the table. Everybody was, expecting Ohio State to perform well. But we really wanted to see how those other teams in the Big Ten, the Penn States, the Wisconsins, the Minnesotas, the Michigans, how they were going to perform. And those were the 5 teams that we talked about as being the 5 teams that had a shot at a Big Ten championship. Now, obviously, Ohio State was the favorite, but still, there were 4 or 5 schools that had their name in the ring, and that all got really I think shaken up more than we were expecting after this week. Look, obviously Ohio State, slow start against Nebraska, ended up pulling away, winning that one 52-17. Wisconsin looked very impressive in their 45-7 win over Illinois. Now you would expect them to thrash Illinois, but again, that was a good start to the season for Wisconsin. Where we do have a lot of intrigue is with Minnesota and Michigan. This game did not end up being as close as I expected. I mean, I picked Minnesota in what essentially I thought was going to be a toss-up kind of game. And really, for the first time in several years, we saw a Michigan team soundly beat a pretty good football team in Minnesota. I mean, this was a 49-24 win for the Wolverines. And again, we'll talk about this a little bit later in the show, but I was impressed with Michigan's performance, and a lot of questions, obviously, for the Golden Gophers after this game. But what really stood out in the Big Ten this weekend, and you already know what it is, in my opinion, the game of the year so far in Penn State, Indiana. A game that, let's be honest, was under the radar, and you probably weren't watching this one until the fourth quarter or until it got close. I flipped this one on halfway through the second quarter just because I noticed that Penn State had a really slow start, right? It was 7-0 at the end of the first, and then Indiana, to their credit, went on a bit of a tear, putting up 17 in the second quarter, actually went into the locker room with a 17-7 lead over the Nittany Lions. And so, coming out of the locker room to start the second half, obviously Penn State had to make up some ground. I mean, they're the number 8 team in the country, trailing by 10 on the road to an Indiana squad that, hasn't had a marquee win against a top 10 team in, I think it's been since like 1987. I saw a statistic during the game. Indiana had the second longest losing streak to AP top 10 teams. The only school in the Power 5 with a longer losing streak against top 10 teams is Wake Forest, and they currently have 63 straight losses, I believe, against top 10 teams. So again, Indiana, right? Indiana football. When's the last time they've made a splash? Not just in their conference, but just in general. So this was a intriguing game, really, in the first half, right? I mean, Indiana comes out in that second quarter after not scoring in the first. They kick a field goal, capping off a 9-play, 22-yard drive. A few minutes later, a 6-play, 62-yard drive results in a touchdown with about 8 minutes left. And then shortly after, they put in another touchdown with 6.5 minutes in the second quarter. And this was really a result of Penn State just stalling on offense, more so than Indiana's offense, just rolling over the Penn State defense. I mean, Penn State, yes, had a lot of mistakes in this game. Yes, played poorly at times. But, I'll be honest with you. While I was watching this game, while I was watching Penn State, Indiana, do you know what team I thought of that did this in the past, where they were far superior in talent and in, skill level, coaching, all that, but still got outplayed or outcoached and just couldn't put together the pieces they needed to win the game? Clemson, right? Clemson's done this before. Not just, back when Clemsoning was a thing 8, 10, 12 years ago. No, I'm talking like a few years ago, losing to Syracuse on the road, losing to Pitt at home, almost losing to NC State at home. Without that missed field goal, the NC State game, Clemson probably loses that one as well. Either way, this was a game where I saw a parallel between Penn State and what Clemson used to do. Now, we'll talk about Clemson later in the show, but how they performed against Syracuse, again, a team that last few years has really given them a good run. Every single time they play, it seems like it's always a close one, regardless of what the rankings or the records say, right? Now, this past week, Clemson pulled away, right? They kind of woke up in the third quarter. That scoop and score, I think, is what really kind of kicked it into gear for the Tigers. And so they ended up, hanging up 47. It was 47-21 win for Clemson. But there have been games in the past where Clemson has not been able to pull away, and that's what happened to Penn State. Penn State, in the second half, was able to kind of claw their way to an 8-point lead. Right? They were up 28-20 with less than 2 minutes to play in the fourth quarter. And at that point, watching it, you're like, okay, even if Indiana scores a touchdown, they still got to get a 2-point conversion. And the odds of them going the distance with less than 2 minutes left, it could happen, but it's slim. And the manner in which they scored, right? Devin Ford, when he ran that one in, it was a 14-yard run into the end zone. Indiana, essentially, they let him score. I don't know if anybody noticed that, but you could see in the linebackers in the secondary for Indiana, and this was coming off a timeout, so there was clearly some coaching involved there where, Indiana said, okay, we're gonna let them score, right? It's 21-20. Penn State had just scored less than a minute prior. The swing of momentum in this game was just crazy because it was 20-14 Indiana, and then Penn State, with just a couple minutes left in the game, they go 3 plays, 74 yards, and all of a sudden it's 21-20. And I'm looking here at the win probability that ESPN uses as part of their metric, and you can just it's like a seismograph for an 8.0 earthquake. It's just zigging, zagging the entire game. Now, it starts out in Penn State's favor, dips really sharp down for Indiana around midway through the second quarter, and then it just kind of stays in the Indiana zone, and then about midway through the fourth, it just shoots way back up to Penn State, shoots back down. It was an incredible roller coaster of emotions. And again, I think it really came down to what happened in the last 3 minutes of regulation, because going into overtime, the team with momentum is at a significant advantage, and so that was part of, I think, their decision, to end up going for 2 here and winning the game in overtime. But when you look at the last few minutes of this game and you break it down, obviously Indiana intentionally let Penn State score, right? That was clearly on purpose. but they still had to drive the length of the field and score a touchdown and convert a 2-point conversion. And I think that speaks to the confidence that the Indiana coaching staff had in their players to perform and execute under a pretty, stressful late game situation. So, again, if you're Penn State, you're coming off this game and you're trying to understand what happened, what did we do wrong? And I think it was less about what Penn State did wrong in the last few minutes, and it was more about what Indiana did right. The decision to let Penn State score is just so counter to everything you would instinctively think to do, but yet it was the right decision. It was the right decision. And they committed to that. They didn't, they let Penn State, they got the ball, Penn State got the ball back after Indiana turned it over on downs. And instead of trying to see, okay, can we stop them one play? Can we stop them 2 plays? They just let them run in, right? One play, 14-yard rushing touchdown for Devin Ford. And you could tell at the very end, he even stopped almost at the 1-yard line and kind of, stuttered before he stepped into the end zone. I'm not sure if that was the coaches that were yelling or if he heard somebody yelling at him, don't go in, don't go in. But there was certainly some hesitation. And the Indiana players, again, they just watched him walk in the end zone. There was no effort to stop him. But that meant that they were going to get the ball back with 1:42, and they were going to have to go the length of the field. And Michael Penix for Indiana played about as well as you could ever ask him to. Just an outstanding performance, by him the entire game. Never really missed a beat. And, to go, 19 for 36, 170 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception doesn't look that impressive on paper, but he made the plays when it mattered and ended up giving his team an opportunity at the end of the game, to force an overtime, and then, ended up winning it in a play that's going to live in Indiana lore for a long, long time. I already saw Old Row Indiana has that shot of Penix stretching out printed on T-shirts, right? They've already got that printed on a T-shirt. And I think, there's been some controversy surrounding, was that the right call? Did he cross the plane before the ball touched out of bounds? Because again, he was suspended in the air, right? Penix was outstretched completely from from the 3-yard line. That's what made it so incredible. At the last point, I believe he touched the ground was at the 3-yard line. So he was outstretched. Well, that'd be about 9 feet. And he was traveling sideways, right, towards the sideline, had been hit by an opposing player. And, a lot of people said, well, okay, the ball does hit the pylon, but it goes to the outside of the pylon. If you watch the replay, the ball, if a ball is outstretched, hits a pylon, and ends up bouncing to the inside of a pylon into the actual field of play in the end zone, it's pretty much a consensus that was a touchdown. When the ball goes to the outside of the pylon, out of bounds, out of the field of play, that's when it becomes a little bit more of a gray area. Really surprising, in all honesty, that this call on the field was that it was a good, the conversion was good. I think, and again, I'm looking at it right now. You can see I got the video pulled up and I got it paused. He stretches out at the 3-yard line and is essentially I'm looking here right now, he's at the 3-yard line to about the half-yard line, outstretched. And as his momentum is pushing him forward, and as the Penn State defender comes in and knocks him, he goes forward, and then right there, I've got it freeze framed, at the exact moment of the ball hitting both the out of bounds line and the pylon. And the line judge is right there. I can't tell whether or not that ball crossed the line before it touches down out of bounds. And what I'll say is, again, I'm looking at the camera angle. It's right down the line. The line judge is closer. He made the call. So I don't see anything that indicates that was a blown call, right? There's nothing there in any replay that indicates definitively he made the wrong call. The line judge made the wrong call. And so in that situation, you have to go with the call on the field. If it was more clear cut, I think there'd be more controversy surrounding the outcome of this call, right? If you were able to tell from video replay that there was clearly a foot out of bounds or an elbow out of bounds or the ball, that I think would raise questions about, okay, well, they missed something and Penn State got robbed. But you can't make that claim because it's literally so close that you can't determine whether or not the ball breaks the plane before it touches down. And so you have to go with what the line judge calls, which is that the conversion was good and that Penn State would lose that game. And again, I just go back to the last 2 minutes of this game. Again, you got a 21-20 score with less than 2 minutes left. Penn State forces a turnover on downs deep in Indiana territory. Like it was kind of like a last-ditch effort for Indiana, right? They turned it over on downs, and then the Hoosiers, they had one timeout. So really stopping the clock was irrelevant at that point. And so they just let Penn State score. And I don't think Penn State was mentally prepared for that being an option. I don't think that they were thinking, okay, Indiana's just going to let us score. And so Devin Ford races untouched into the end zone, and he realizes that it's a mistake. He realizes he's been set up. He realizes that he has been, given the touchdown too late as he crosses the plane, and all of a sudden it's a 28-20 lead, and Indiana has the ball, and they drive it 75 yards, score with 22 seconds left. And you listen, as impressive as the overtime conversion was, I think the 2-point attempt to tie in regulation was equally phenomenal. I mean, Michael Penix, again, he just finessed. That was the word when I was watching that came to mind. He just finessed those Penn State defenders. A lot of times you don't see quarterbacks scramble for 2-point convert, and this guy just owned it, man. He just owned it. And that speaks, again, to the level of confidence that Indiana coach Tom Allen has in his guys. And, interestingly, I'm reading here in his post-game press conference, he did admit that they have a signal to their defense to let the opposing team score, and we made that call. He did say, though, that he was surprised that Penn State went ahead and scored. He was expecting him to go down. And that's what James Franklin echoed in his post-game press conference, right? He said, supposedly, Penn State said they went through that situation this week in practice, but they could have handled it better, and he admitted that. But, both coaches basically said, listen, Indiana said, hey, we're going to let them score, but we don't really expect them to take that opportunity. And you got James Franklin for Penn State saying that the plan was to stop short. The plan was not to score. So it's really a mental error that cost Penn State. But again, right, you think about the fact that going up by 8 with less than 2 minutes left, when the opposing team has one timeout, like, what are the odds? What are the odds that you end up losing that game? It can't be high. It can't be high. And also you got to remember too, the tying drive of this game was 75 yards, the longest drive for Indiana that day. They had not driven the ball they had not gone the distance of the field from where you get the ball after a touchback all day. So statistically, what was your win probability? Like upper 90%? I feel like, yes, it was a mental error, But still, they were in a great position to win that game. They really were. Now, bleeding the clock would have certainly ended the game, but again, I feel like this is, and I've said it again, I'll repeat this. I feel like this is less about what Penn State did wrong and more about what Indiana did right. They made the right call to let them score. Tom Allen trusted his guys to drive the length of the field. Penix made big plays when it mattered. And, even before overtime, right? I'm sure this is a little blip because most people, they focus on the last, couple minutes and then the overtime possession. Don't forget, after Indiana scored, before overtime, Penn State had a possession where, there was a squib kick. Indiana's kicker squibbed it, and it was a botched squib kick. Penn State got the ball at the Indiana 49, and Jordan Stout had a 57-yard field goal that would have tied the school record that came up just a yard short. I mean, another couple rotations of the ball, and I think it goes in. It was a phenomenal effort, phenomenal kick. And you could, again, you almost sense like, oh my goodness, we've gone back and forth, and all this has happened in the last 2 minutes of this game, and Penn State's going to win it on a last-second field goal because Indiana botched it. It was just like, what? I mean, you could tell, again, Tom Allen was like, what happened? Everybody was like, what happened? What just happened? But fate had other plans, and so we went into overtime. Again, Indiana's coaching again, it's just amazing to me. Indiana's coaching staff, Tom Allen, they elected to just end the game with the 2-point conversion attempt, and they trusted their main man, Penix, to get it done, and he was successful in that conversion. Whether or not it was the right call, I think doesn't really matter in this particular discussion because we've already talked about that. We've already talked about the fact that there's really no conclusive evidence that indicates it was the wrong call. Unless there is something definitive that you can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that was the wrong call, you have no right to bitch and moan if you're a Penn State fan about getting robbed by the refs. You need to look at, okay, we scored and didn't take time off the clock. We had the ball. After a botched squib kick. And couldn't get anything there, right? We had the 57-yard attempt that was no good. So again, huge shakeup in the Big Ten in terms of which teams are likely to be jockeying for a Big Ten title game position. And I still felt like Ohio State was the front runner in the East Division. I didn't think that Penn State was quite there in terms of being able to challenge them. And we'll see. The games, this weekend, they're going to be taking on Ohio State. This game's going to be at home. You got to think that either Penn State is going to come out fired up and they're going to play inspired. Because remember, they beat Ohio State. They'll hold a tiebreaker over them. So they're going to come out and play super inspired, or they're going to have a really bad hangover and they're just going to get trounced. I don't think there's any other outcome for this game. It's again, I don't see Penn State thrashing Ohio State. I see it either being a really close game where both teams play their hearts out, leave it all out on the field, or I see just Penn State just not showing up, not being emotionally there, and Ohio State will run away with this division. So it's crazy to say that a week into the Big Ten season, but that's really what happens when you drop a game. And again, credit to Indiana, the Hoosiers. Again, that was their first win over a top 10 opponent in 33 years. And what's crazy is they did it by allowing their opponent to score. Fascinating game. One of the best games I've honestly ever seen, and certainly the best game I've seen this year. That was just a great game and a huge win for Indiana. Maybe we'll see what it does for their program. Okay, let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to be talking about the UNC performance, how they made a bit of a statement against NC State this past weekend. That's next. Stick with us. Welcome back to the show. Again, you are listening to After Further Review. I'm Jay Smith, and we got more college football to talk about. Let's transition from the Big Ten over to the ACC, where UNC, coming off their surprising debacle against Florida State, really, I think, made a statement in their win against NC State. And again, NC State is, a team that was 4-1 coming into this game, still unproven in a lot of ways. I mean, you look at who NC State had played up to this point, and while I don't think they had a soft schedule, it wasn't like you could make an argument that they were a legit contender in the ACC, right? I mean, they had a close win against Wake to start off, a Wake team that's should not pose a challenge to any good team, especially in the ACC, right? That was a 45-42 win for the Wolfpack. Turned around a week later and lost pretty badly on the road at Virginia Tech, 45-24. They took care of Pitt at this was on the road. So the week after the Virginia Tech loss, they beat Pitt on the road 30-29. They've beaten UVA and Duke, but a lot of their games have been really close. Obviously the win with Pitt was 30-29, Wake Forest 45-42. The Virginia Tech loss looked pretty bad, so there was still, I think, some things left to prove for NC State. Now, if they had come out and they had, outplayed, outcoached, outperformed UNC in all phases of the game, offense, defense, special teams, this is a totally different conversation. Even if this game is close, even if this game was close, I think we're having a conversation about how NC State has really improved and they've become a solid team in the ACC, at least this season, with a further opportunity to prove that against Miami the following week, right? They're going to play Miami November 6th. That's their next matchup scheduled. But that didn't happen. That didn't happen for the Wolfpack. They got thoroughly beaten across the board by, I think, a UNC team that was looking, to prove something. They had something to prove. A UNC team that certainly had high hopes coming into this season, certainly had high hopes after the first few weeks, sitting at number 5 in the country before their loss to Florida State. And, again, I think this is a statement win for North Carolina to remind everyone, especially teams in the ACC, hey, we're good, we're legit, and yeah, we played really poorly against Florida State the week prior, but that does not mean you shouldn't take us seriously. They've obviously got Notre Dame and Miami coming up on their schedule. They don't have to play Clemson this year. I'm sure they're happy about that since they're already 4-1. But UVA and Duke and Wake Forest, the next 3 games, you've got to expect them to get through them. You really have got to expect North Carolina to be at 7-1 going into the Notre Dame matchup. And honestly, even if Notre Dame were to lose to Clemson, I think both North Carolina and Notre Dame will be top 10 teams by the time of that game. We'll see where Miami is. Miami, obviously, they looked okay in their close win against UVA. It was a 19-14 kind of slobber knocker, sloppy game. Wasn't very impressive, especially considering how they performed weeks prior. Now, Miami has, again, opportunity here with at NC State and at Virginia Tech the next couple of weeks. 2 teams that are no longer ranked. And, we just touched on NC State and whether or not they're legitimately a a team to be taken seriously in the ACC, but I still think if Miami comes out and throttles NC State and Virginia Tech, two teams that were ranked at some point this season, that will reestablish their credibility after a rather lackluster 19-14 win against Virginia. So there's going to be a lot of shaking up in terms of the power rankings within the ACC, I think, in the next couple of weeks, because, again, right now it's Clemson, and it's still everybody else. I just don't think Notre Dame is in that Clemson caliber yet. I just don't think they are. And I'm not saying that because Notre Dame has, for the last so-and-so years, they've just done nothing in big games. That's not just there's a lot of inconsistency with Notre Dame. And when Clemson was about to play Miami, right, there had been no inconsistency from Miami. Miami had looked hot every game they played. And so there wasn't a lot there to say, well, I don't know if Miami's up to the task. Taking, again, forget about what happened 3 years, 5 years ago. That does not matter anymore. What only matters is this season. And I felt like Miami had shown up to that point a consistent level of play. Maybe they were going to challenge Clemson. Obviously, that didn't happen. With Notre Dame, it's a little bit different because Notre Dame is sitting at 4-0. But we all remember the Duke game that was close. Certainly, the Louisville game looms large, a 12-7 victory in just what was a really, just inconsistent performance. Inconsistent. But then they turn around and they beat USF 52-0, and then they beat Pitt 45-3 on the road. So, again, in terms of power rankings in the ACC, I feel like it's still Clemson and everybody else. I just don't think Notre Dame has proven enough their ability to be consistent. They have Georgia Tech this weekend, and then obviously the big game, the game of their season, is hosting Clemson November 7th. That is going to be a huge game and one of the biggest road games for Clemson in years, honestly. Not just because Notre Dame's in the ACC, but anytime you're in a top 5 road game, that is an opportunity to make a statement as a program. Again, I know Clemson right now, number 1 team in the country. You look at all their success, wins, all these records, right, that Clemson's had the last few years. Top 5 road wins are cornerstones of dynasties and of great successful programs. So, putting aside everything Clemson has accomplished the last decade, beating a top 5 team on the road is still a huge accomplishment. And it's, again, the game of the season in the ACC. Notre Dame hosting Clemson should be a great matchup. But again, going back to this discussion on what the ACC looks like in terms of power rankings, you pull up the standings right now in the ACC, and it looks different, obviously not having divisions, but you've got Clemson at the top, and we're just going to look at conference records here. Clemson's sitting at 5-0 in conference. Notre Dame is at 4-0. Now, you would expect both of these teams to be undefeated going into their matchup on November 7th. And even if Notre Dame were to lose or Clemson were to lose, you're only sitting at 1 conference loss. The only other teams right now in the ACC with 1 conference loss are Miami and North Carolina. Now, Clemson has already beaten Miami, so they would hold the tiebreaker over the Hurricanes. When it comes to the Tar Heels, oh boy, I have to refresh my tiebreaker rules to know how that's decided. Maybe it's the record you have against common opponents. I'm not sure. I'd have to do some research on that. But assuming Clemson wins this game, for the sake of simplicity, Notre Dame, again, they have, let's say they have that 1 conference loss, and they're going to play, pulling up Notre Dame's schedule, they're going to play UNC. They don't play Miami. But, Miami, let's see. Miami has, obviously, they played Clemson. They'll play UNC, but they won't play Notre. So there seems to be, again, it's kind of a lot to do in my head. So it could get really, really interesting for that second spot in the ACC championship game, assuming nobody else loses a game other than the ones we're discussing, which isn't super likely, but still something that could potentially play out. Either way, back to this UNC-NC State discussion, I think it reaffirms who's near the top and who's not there yet. And Clemson, Notre Dame, Miami, and North Carolina are right now the 4 best teams in the ACC. And I think that's for the ACC to have 4 top 15 teams, I think speaks to the conference finally getting out of that it's only Clemson and everybody else sucks rut that they were in for the last few years. I mean, I know Notre Dame's ACC allegiance will only be for this year, but let's be honest, they play an ACC schedule. They just don't want to join the ACC because of their contract with NBC for their football games. So for all intents and purposes, Notre Dame is a member of the ACC. They are in all their other sports except for football. So whatever. But Miami and North Carolina should be taken seriously. Again, not making the claim that they're on the same caliber level as Clemson. Could they beat Clemson? Maybe. Miami sure didn't. We'll see what Notre Dame does. Again, North Carolina, they don't have to worry about Clemson this year. But the NC States, the Virginia Techs, the Boston Colleges, the Wake Forest, even the Pitt, right? A team that started off the year ranked and at least favored to kind of make some noise, right? They've fallen to 2-4 in conference play. Again, we're as the season has progressed and as we've kind of hit this midway point, we're now starting to see who is a contender and who was a pretender. And the teams that were pretenders were Pittsburgh, Virginia Tech, NC State. I'm not going to include Wake Forest and Boston College because nobody really ever thought that they were contenders anyway. But the contenders right now are Clemson, Notre Dame, Miami, and North Carolina. Now, the top 2 are certainly Clemson and Notre Dame. Miami is on the outside looking in because of their loss to Clemson. North Carolina is still a bit of a wild card. If you were to ask me right now, rank the teams in the ACC on like power rankings, like who do you think is the best in the ACC? My top 4 would be Clemson, I'll give Notre Dame the nod, even though they've been really inconsistent. Clemson, Notre Dame, North Carolina, and then Miami. And I know some people are going to say, well, Miami's loss to Clemson looks a lot better than North Carolina's loss to Florida State. And that's a valid point. But I think North Carolina's body of work has been a little bit more consistent than Miami's. And that's not just because of North Carolina's drubbing of NC State. It's just, again, throughout the season, they've shown a little bit more consistency than Miami. Miami started off really, really hot. But ever since that loss to Clemson, they played Pitt really close. UVA, they were sloppy. We'll see how they do against NC State. Once we have a chance to see Miami and North Carolina's performance against a common opponent in North Carolina, that'll give us a better idea of where things really sit in that 3rd and 4th slot. But again, I think this is a solid performance for UNC. I think Mac Brown had his guys ready to go. And I think it makes the ACC more intriguing now because there's a 4th team in the running, in the mix, in the conversation. Because coming into this week, it was really just Clemson, Notre Dame, Miami, and then, let's see what happens with UNC, NC State. If North Carolina loses to NC State, they drop much further, and NC State still really needs another couple of wins to earn the legitimacy because obviously North Carolina will have been coming off of a Florida State loss, and then they just lost to NC State, so everybody's just going to say, oh, well, how good really was North Carolina? Not, oh, wow, that's a great win for NC State. Again, key thing here, if North Carolina was undefeated going into that game, if they were a top 5 team and NC State plays them and beats them, conversation is all about, wow, NC State, man, they're a legit contender in the ACC now. You got to take them seriously. But because North Carolina lost to Florida State in the fashion that they did, it would be a totally different conversation. So, interesting stuff out of the ACC. I think it's one of the more intriguing conferences this year. I know we haven't had the Big Ten or the Pac-12, but really, man, I mean, the SEC has been a mess. It is a hot mess right now, and the Big 12 has really been a hot mess. So I think the ACC has up to this point provided the most intrigue amongst the Power 5 conferences. But if you've got an opinion otherwise, let me know. I'd love to hear what you think about which conference is the most interesting so far this season. Okay, one last break, and when we come back, we're going to touch on... What are we going to touch on? Oh, yeah, is Michigan finally for real? Good win against Minnesota this past weekend. What does that mean for Jim Harbaugh and the Wolverines this year? We will discuss that next. Welcome back to the show. Thanks so much for tuning in. Again, I'm Jay Smith, and this is After Further Review. And hey, thanks for listening on the podcast, or again, if you're watching on Facebook, however you are tuning in to the show. It is very much appreciated. Okay, last segment of this episode, Michigan. 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 The Wolverines have let me down year after year after year. Every year I'm like, no, this is the year they're going to finally beat Ohio State. This is the year where old Mr. Khaki Pants himself is finally going to do something, and they're not going to finish in the middle of their division. Is this the year for Michigan? Well, I don't know. I don't know. Nobody knows. Certainly too early to tell, but I really do think this is an impressive win. In all seriousness, a 49-24 win on the road, season opener, is impressive. It is impressive. And I think you've got to be feeling really good if you're Michigan. If you're Minnesota, you got a lot of questions now, but I was really I was impressed. I was impressed because here's the thing about Michigan, right? A lot of times their offense has been inconsistent. I mean, Shea Patterson is inconsistent. Michigan had 7 touchdowns in this game. Didn't need to kick a field goal. Trying to see how many times they had to punt. I know at the beginning they went 3 and out. According to the play-by-play, Michigan punted. They punted once, and it was the opening drive. They did turn the ball over on downs, but that was so only one punt in the entire game for the Wolverines. And really, honestly, pretty impressive scoring drives for Michigan, right? They had they had a I don't know if this was as much a great offensive play as it was a blown defensive play, but I mean, obviously that touchdown early in the first quarter where Zach Charbonnet, I think Charbonnet ran it 70 yards. So, I mean, that was a one-play 70-yard drive right there. Then you had the scoop and score. So, establishing momentum early, forcing the turnover, again, scoop and score. It's all about momentum. But, yeah, throughout this game, I mean, they had a 10-play 77-yard drive, a 4-play 29-yard drive, a 9-play 68-yard drive, a 5-play 96-yard drive. And they did it relatively quickly. The 96-yard drive was less than 2 minutes. The 68-yard drive was 4 minutes. The 77-yard drive was about 5 minutes. So I was impressed with Michigan's offensive performance in this game. I thought Milton for Michigan played well. He's 15 for 22 for 225 yards and a touchdown. Didn't make any big mistakes. They didn't turn the ball over. Minnesota did twice. And Minnesota really, they owned the clock. They possessed the ball for over 35 minutes. But when Michigan had the ball, they were extremely efficient with it. They moved the ball quickly. They kept Minnesota on their heels on defense. And again, from an offensive standpoint, I don't think you really could have asked for much more out of Michigan. They executed when they needed to execute. And if on the flip of that, Minnesota needs to clean up their, some things on defense. Obviously, there's a lot of blown assignments. 70-yard runs are not something that you really want to be giving up, especially 2.5 minutes into a football game when your guys aren't gassed. I mean, that's just a blown assignment, right? So I feel like for Michigan, they've certainly got to have a good feeling coming out of this game. And when like we did a few shows ago, when you look at their schedule, it's brutal. We talked about this, how they just got screwed for their schedule compared to Minnesota, Wisconsin, Penn State, and Ohio State, where all those schools are only playing a couple tough. I mean, Michigan's got Minnesota. Then they've got at Indiana in a couple weeks. Hey, that game maybe who knows, right? It could be college game day for all we know. Indiana getting the 17 ranking this week. And then they got Wisconsin, Penn State, and then at Ohio State. And don't forget about a Rutgers team, Maryland, and Michigan State. Now, they should take care of those last three, even if Rutgers won their game this past weekend. I'm not saying that Rutgers winning was a fluke, but it was just Michigan State. Two cellar-dweller teams in the Big Ten right now. So Michigan, while they have to be looking at their schedule and they have to be thinking, oh my God, this is a gauntlet, I think they have to be feeling much better about their chances because of how they performed against Minnesota. If they had squeaked out a win, if it was a 1 or 2 possession game, I think they would have been like, okay, we can compete, but we're not gonna roll anybody, or we're not quite there in terms of being a head and shoulders above our competition. Well, now after this performance against a team in Minnesota that a lot of people, including myself, thought were going to win this game, you've got to be feeling really good going into the Indiana matchup, even the Wisconsin matchup. We'll see how Penn State performs as the season progresses before we really give before I give an opinion on how I think that game is going to go. Obviously, the marquee game for them is at Ohio State at the end of the year, right? The Ohio State hurdle, the roadblock, the mental barrier that Michigan has created around Ohio State is almost something similar to what we saw with Clemson losing to South Carolina. I think it was 5 straight years when Spurrier was there, and it was just like Clemson, the turnover differential was terrible. And they just didn't play well. It was just almost like a mental thing, more so than it was. South Carolina was always the more talented team. Some years that was the case, but Clemson never could get over that hurdle, and they finally were able to. And Michigan will win, against Ohio State one day, but you got to wonder, how much of it is them psyching themselves out. So they're going to need good performances against Indiana. They're going to need good performances against Wisconsin and Penn State to have the right mindset going into that road game at Ohio State to cap off their season. So I'm not going to say they're the real deal. I'm certainly not going to say that they're back. But I think they're going to be a team to watch. They're going to be a team to watch in the Big Ten. And if they get through Indiana and they get through Wisconsin, it really opens up an opportunity for them to create a lot of noise in the East, this year. And we'll have to see, again, how the Big Ten shapes up. I believe, again, being the only Power 5 conference with divisions, but should be interesting. So a little bit of intrigue coming out of the Big Ten. And before we wrap up this show, let's see if we can pull up the College Pick'em League, see what our current standings are. And looks like our big winner from, well, it would be helpful if the point totals were there. Let's see if we can get, okay, there we go. Okay, so our big winners from this past week with 8 correct picks, my goodness. Hannah Reagan, Trey, and Razorback 11. Congratulations to those 3. I believe this is Hannah and Trey's first week in the top spot for Pick'em, and I think Razorback 11's been there 1 or 2 times before. Right now, the full leaderboard is getting really tight. We got Aaron Long currently at 32. He's in first place. I'm sitting at 30 points, and then we have Razorback 11 at 29, Hannah Reagan's at 28, and Jackson Wright is also at 28. That rounds out our top 5. So still a lot of people jockeying for position on the College Pick'em board. But again, congratulations to Hannah Reagan, Trey, and Razorback 11 for their 8 correct picks this week. That's all the time we got, though, for this edition of After Further Review. Appreciate you tuning in. We'll be back later this week with some more storylines and to break down some of the big matchups for this coming weekend. It's going to be a great weekend of college football. Enjoy your Halloween. See you later this week. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Jay Smith, and this has been After Further Review.